The Sodder family, before the fire, George and Jenny Sodder, were the proud heads of a large, close-knit family living in Fayetteville, West Virginia. During the 1940s, George, born Giorgio Sadu in Tula, Sardinia, had left his homeland as a young boy and immigrated to the United States at the turn of the century. After arriving in Pennsylvania, he worked in various manual labor jobs, eventually finding stable employment with the railroads. Over time, George learned English, American customs, and the value of hard work, but he never lost the sharp mind and independent spirit he brought from Italy. By his 20s, he had moved to West Virginia and established a coal trucking business that would support his family for decades. Jenny, also an Italian immigrant, came from a family that had settled in West Virginia. The two met through the Italian-American community and married in the early 1920s. Over the years, they had 10 children: John, George Jr., Marion, Morris, Martha, Louis, Jenny Jr., Betty, Sylvia, and Joe. Life in their household was full of noise, laughter, and the chaos that only a large family can bring. They lived in a spacious 2-story wooden house 2 miles north of town. With the business office attached to the front, the Sodders were well respected, known for their generosity, but George was outspoken about politics, particularly his hatred of Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. In the years before the fire, his comments caused friction within the local Italian community. Some people who had once been friendly became cold, and one man even warned George that his outspoken stance would bring trouble to his family. In the fall of 1945, unsettling encounters began to occur. A stranger visited the house to ask for work, but while there, he pointed at the fuse box and said, "This will cause a fire someday." George found the remark odd, especially since the wiring had recently been checked and deemed safe. Later, a traveling insurance salesman tried to sell George a policy. When George declined, the man became angry, allegedly saying, "Your house is going to go up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed. You'll be paid for your dirty remarks about Mussolini." George dismissed it as bluster, but the memory would haunt him later. Despite these strange episodes, the Sodder family prepared for Christmas 1945 in high spirits. The war had ended, and Joe, their eldest, was still away in the army, but would be home soon. The younger children were thrilled to help decorate the tree and hang stockings. Jenny baked cookies, and George worked on last-minute business tasks before taking a rare break. In hindsight, the holiday atmosphere seemed like the calm before a terrible storm, a peaceful moment in time before tragedy would shatter their world. Christmas Eve 1945. The night begins December 24th, 1945. Began like any other Christmas Eve for the Sodders, only better. The war had ended just a few months earlier, and for the first time in years, the family could celebrate without the shadow of conflict. 9 of the 10 children were home. Only the eldest, Joe, was absent, still stationed in the army but expected to return soon. The house was warm and festive, with the scent of pine from the Christmas tree mingling with aromas from Jenny's kitchen. Marion, the third oldest child and one of the working daughters, came home from her job at a local dime store with special gifts for her younger siblings, candy and small trinkets wrapped in bright paper. That evening, the family gathered in the living room after dinner. The younger children, Morris, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jenny Jr., 8, and Betty, 5, were especially excited. Even little Sylvia, just 2 years old, sensed the occasion and toddled about trying to keep up with the bigger kids. The older boys, John, 23, and George Jr., 16, helped finish chores, hauling coal for the heating stove and tidying up. The children begged to stay up later than usual to play with their new toys. Jenny, softening in the holiday spirit, agreed. On one condition, the older boys had to watch over the younger ones and make sure the curtains were closed and the lights turned off when they went to bed by 10 p.m. George had retired upstairs for the night. Jenny followed not long after, taking Sylvia with her. The sounds of laughter and soft music from the radio drifted up the stairs. Around 12:30 a.m., Jenny was startled awake by the ringing of the telephone. She went downstairs and answered. On the other end was a woman's voice asking for someone Jenny didn't know. Behind the voice, she heard laughter and clinking glasses, as if a party were going on. Jenny told the caller she had the wrong number, and the woman laughed again in a strange, almost mocking way before hanging up as Jenny set the receiver. Back in place, she noticed the lights were still on and the curtains open. The children had fallen asleep on the couches, their toys scattered around them. Marion had dozed off too after a long day of work. Jenny closed the curtains, turned off the lights, and went back upstairs. Just as she was about to drift off, she heard a sudden loud noise like something hitting the roof, followed by a rolling sound. She sat up, listening, but when the noise stopped, she convinced herself it might have been snow sliding off the roof. Outside, the December night was cold and still. At that moment, no one in the house could have imagined that the next hour would bring panic, chaos, and an unsolved mystery that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The fire breaks out. It was roughly 1:30 a.m. when Jenny Sodder was jolted awake for the second time that night, not by a phone call, but by the faint smell of smoke. At first she thought it might be the wood stove in the kitchen, but within seconds the odor thickened. She threw on her robe, hurried to the hallway, and was met with an orange glow coming from George's home office. Flames had already begun to curl along the walls. Devouring papers and creeping toward the ceiling, Jenny screamed for her husband and children. George leapt from bed and immediately rushed to wake the older boys, John and George Jr., who were sleeping in a first-floor bedroom. The two quickly followed their parents to the hallway, but the wooden staircase leading to the second floor, where the 5 younger children slept, was already engulfed in heat and smoke. Jenny's heart pounded as she called their names over and over. Morris, Martha, Louie, Jenny, Betty. There was no answer. George ran outside barefoot, his breath visible in the icy December air, to grab the family's ladder, which was usually propped against the side of the house. To his horror, it wasn't there. Without hesitation, he sprinted to one of his coal trucks parked nearby, intending to drive it up to the house so he could climb onto the roof. But when he turned, the key, the truck, which had worked perfectly the day before, refused to start. He dashed to the second truck, same result. Both vehicles were dead. Inside, Jenny had scooped up little Sylvia and ushered Marion out into the yard. The cold bit at their skin, but the sting of the smoke in their lungs was worse. Desperate, Marion ran to a neighbor's house to call the fire department, only to discover that no operator answered. Another neighbor tried contacting Fire Chief F.J. Morris directly, but Fayetteville's small volunteer fire department relied on a phone tree system one person had to call. Another, who then called another, until the word reached all the firemen. This meant precious time was slipping away. Meanwhile, George tried one last desperate act, breaking a window to try to climb inside. He sliced his arm badly in the process, but the smoke was so thick and the heat so intense that he couldn't advance more than a few feet. The family could only stand outside in the frigid air, watching helplessly as flames consumed the home they had built. The children's upstairs bedroom windows glowed with the reflection of the fire, but no silhouettes appeared. Within 45 minutes, the 2-story house collapsed into smoldering ruins. The silence afterward was almost worse than the crackling of the fire. No cries, no movement, only the occasional hiss of embers cooling in the snow by dawn. Neighbors began to gather, offering comfort but little else. The fire department had yet to arrive. The Sodders huddled together in disbelief, their minds already racing with questions. Why had the trucks failed? Where was the ladder? Why had the fire spread so quickly? The answers, they would soon learn, were far from simple and far from comforting. The initial aftermath, by the time Fire Chief F.J. Morris and his small volunteer crew arrived at the Sodder property, it was well past sunrise. Some reports put their arrival as late as 8 a.m., nearly 6 hours after the fire began. The two-story family home was gone, reduced to a charred, skeletal outline atop a smoldering mound of ash. The bitter cold of the early morning mixed with the acrid smell of burned wood, giving the scene an eerie stillness that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the night before. The Sodders had been standing outside all this time, wrapped in blankets provided by neighbors, their skin still pink from the heat of the flames and their faces pale with shock. The reality of the situation was slowly dawning on them. 5 of their children, Morris, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jenny Jr., 8, and Betty, 5, had not made it out of the house. Officially, they were presumed dead, their remains buried somewhere in the smoldering wreckage. Chief Morris began the investigation with what tools and manpower he had, but the search was brief. He concluded that the blaze was caused by faulty wiring, despite the fact that George had recently had the electrical system inspected and approved by the local power company. More troubling to George and Jenny was the fact that the Christmas lights had remained on during the early stages of the fire, something that should not have been possible if the wiring had truly failed in a catastrophic way. The most shocking revelation came when the firemen completed their sweep of the site. There were no human remains. Not a single bone fragment, tooth, or trace of the 5 children could be found. Morris attempted to explain this by suggesting that the bodies had been completely cremated in the fire, but George and Jenny were immediately skeptical. Fires, they knew, did not burn hot enough or long enough to destroy bones entirely. In fact, a crematorium requires temperatures of 1,400 to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit sustained for several hours to reduce a body to ash, and even then, bone fragments remain. The Sodder fire had burned for less than an hour. Despite these inconsistencies, death certificates were issued for the missing children within a few days. The documents listed the cause of death as fire and noted no suspicious circumstances. George and Jenny were expected to accept that their 5 children had perished and move on. But the more they thought about it, the less sense it made. In the days immediately following the fire, George bulldozed a layer of dirt over the remains of the home, both to preserve the site from scavengers and to begin the process of creating a memorial garden. Some later criticized him for disturbing a potential crime scene, but at the time, George was operating on instinct, trying to shield his family from the sight of the blackened ruins. Still, the unanswered questions piled up. Where were the bodies? Why had the fire department taken so long to arrive? And why did the official explanation feel like it was trying to close the book on the tragedy before the ink was even dry? The Sodders' grief was already immense, but soon it would be joined by something else: suspicion, strange clues, and missing evidence. In the days after the fire, grief weighed heavily on the Sodder family, but that grief was increasingly mixed with a gnawing sense of doubt. The official conclusion that the 5 missing children had perished in the flames seemed weaker with every passing day. As George and Jenny began piecing together details, they uncovered a trail of oddities and suspicious circumstances that pointed to something far more sinister. The first discovery came quickly: the family's ladder. which George had desperately searched for on the night of the fire, was found discarded down a steep embankment about 75 feet away from the house. It hadn't fallen there accidentally. It looked as though someone had deliberately moved it. This fact alone bothered George. In a true accident, why would someone take the time to remove a ladder from the property? Then came the telephone line. Mystery. Initially, the phone company told the Sodders that the fire had burned through the wires. But when a repairman examined the line, he reported that it had been cut, not melted. The cut was about 14 feet up the utility pole, far out of reach for someone standing on the ground without equipment. This suggested that someone had climbed up and severed the line before the fire began, effectively cutting off the family's ability to call for help. Other strange reports trickled in from neighbors. One man claimed he had seen someone stealing a block and tackle from the Sodder property on the night of the fire, a device George used to remove engines from his coal trucks. This might explain why both trucks had mysteriously refused to start when George tried to use them to reach the second floor. Another person reported seeing a man at the fire scene taking small mechanical parts from one of the vehicles. Jenny could not forget the loud thump she had heard on the roof shortly before the fire. Her mind kept returning to it. Weeks later, while wandering the yard, her daughter Sylvia, then only 2 years old, found a small, hard, green rubber object in the grass. George immediately recognized it as resembling a type of handheld incendiary device used during World War II, sometimes called a pineapple bomb, for its shape and texture. Witness accounts from outside the immediate neighborhood also added to the mystery. A woman who ran a tourist stop 50 miles west of Fayetteville claimed she saw the missing children the morning after the fire, traveling in a car with several adults she did not know. Another witness said she had served breakfast to 5 children, matching their description at a roadside diner, accompanied by 2 men and 2 women of Italian-looking appearance. Despite these leads, authorities remained fixed on their original theory. The children had died in the fire, and the lack of remains was simply an anomaly. For George and Jenny, however, the mounting evidence pointed in the opposite direction. They began to suspect that the fire had been a cover for a kidnapping, a deliberate act meant to remove their children from their lives. This suspicion would drive them into a years-long investigation that would consume their savings, their time, and eventually the rest of their lives. The official report and the cause of fire in the immediate aftermath of the blaze. The Fayette County authorities moved with surprising speed to close the case. Within just a few days, the coroner's office issued death certificates for Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny Jr., and Betty Sodder, listing the cause of death simply as fire and the date as December 25, 1945. No further qualifications. Number. Mention of missing remains, just a final statement that left no room for questions. The official investigation, led by Fire Chief F. J. Morris, declared the cause to be faulty electrical wiring. According to Morris, the fire had started near George's office and spread rapidly through the wooden frame of the house, consuming everything in its path. He insisted that the blaze had been hot enough to cremate the children's bodies completely, leaving no bones or teeth behind. This conclusion was accepted without forensic evidence, without photographs, and without the kind of thorough analysis one might expect in a case involving multiple fatalities. George and Jenny found this explanation not only inadequate but suspicious. Just months earlier, they had hired the local power company to upgrade their wiring as part of renovations to their home. The work had been inspected and certified as safe. On the night of the fire, the Christmas lights had remained on during the early stages of the blaze, a clear contradiction to the idea that faulty wiring had caused a sudden electrical failure. In their minds, this detail alone should have forced investigators to reconsider their conclusions. The Sodders also questioned the fire department's slow response. Fayetteville's volunteer crew didn't arrive until hours after the fire was over, citing difficulties in assembling men through their phone tree system. Even if that were true, George found it troubling that not a single firefighter had attempted to dig thoroughly through the debris once they were on the scene. The search lasted only a few hours, and no outside specialists were brought in to help. Later, George would recall a strange conversation with Chief Morris in which the fire chief admitted he had found something in the ashes, a small piece of what appeared to be flesh, but had buried it at the site without showing anyone. Morris explained that he believed it to be an organ from one of the children, though why he chose to conceal it instead of sending it for analysis remained a mystery. For years, the final insult came when the state fire marshal's office refused to reopen the investigation despite the Sodders' pleas. Letters to local officials, the governor's office, and even the FBI were met with either polite rejections or complete silence. The official position remained fixed. The children had died in the fire, and the absence of remains was simply an unfortunate quirk of circumstance, but for George and Jenny, the matter was far from over. The contradictions, the inconsistencies, and the strange behavior of both witnesses and officials had convinced them that something far more complex and far more sinister had taken place. Their next step would be to dig deeper on their own, regardless of the cost. No remains found. Fire theory scrutinized as days turned into weeks after the fire. One question overshadowed all others in George and Jenny Sodder's minds. Where were the bodies? They had lived through tragedy before friends lost in mine. Accidents, neighbors killed in storms, but never had they heard of a house fire completely erasing human remains. Even a layperson knew that in most cases, bones, teeth, and other fragments could survive intense heat. Jenny, in particular, could not let the matter rest. She began quietly conducting her own research, driven not only by grief, but by a growing suspicion that the official narrative was deeply flawed. Her first step was to contact a local crematorium. The operator there explained that in order to reduce a body to ash, they maintained a furnace temperature between 1,400 and 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 to 3 hours. Even after this process, he said there were always recognizable bone fragments that had to be manually ground down before being mixed with ash. The Sodder house fire had burned for roughly 45 minutes before the roof collapsed. It was fueled primarily by wooden walls, furniture, and some coal in the basement, not by the controlled, high-heat environment of a crematorium. To Jenny, the conclusion was inescapable. Even if her 5 children had perished in the blaze, there should have been something left: skull fragments, teeth, pieces of bone. To test her theory further, Jenny burned animal bones in a fire pit behind their temporary home. She tried chicken bones, beef bones, even large pork joints. In each case, no matter how hot or long she let the fire burn, recognizable bone fragments remained afterward. These experiments only reinforced her belief that the children's bodies had not been in the house when it burned. The family's doubts were echoed by others. A local cremation expert who heard about the case stated publicly that the absence of remains in such a short burn time was inconceivable. Friends and neighbors began to whisper that the fire might have been staged to hide another crime, perhaps abduction. The insurance salesman's ominous warning weeks before, the missing ladder, the disabled trucks, and the cut telephone line all seemed to fit into a more sinister puzzle. Adding to Jenny's unease was the memory of the thump she had heard on the roof just before the fire broke out. Some locals speculated it might have been a small explosive or incendiary device. If so, This could explain the rapid spread of the flames, as well as why the children may have been taken beforehand or lured out before the fire was set. Still, the authorities refused to reconsider their stance. In official files, the matter was closed. The Sodder children were declared dead, and any suggestion to the contrary was brushed aside as the product of grief-stricken parents unable to accept their loss. But George and Jenny were not simply grieving, they were investigating. They began gathering every rumor, every witness account, and every fragment of physical evidence they could find. If the state would not search for their children, they would do it themselves. Jenny's experiments and crematorium insights in the months following the fire. Jenny Sodder's quiet determination transformed into something more methodical. The authorities had declared her children dead, but their explanation, the complete incineration of 5 bodies in under an hour, clashed so sharply with what she knew about fire that she felt compelled to investigate further. Her earlier bone-burning experiments had convinced her that something was wrong, but she wanted professional confirmation from people who understood the science of heat and human remains. She began writing letters to crematoriums across the United States, carefully outlining the circumstances of the fire and asking whether such complete destruction was possible. The responses came back consistently: no, it was not. Time and again, professionals explained that even in the most ideal conditions for total burning industrial furnaces, operating at thousands of degrees Fahrenheit for hours, bones, especially from children, would still be present in recognizable form. Teeth, in particular, were known to be remarkably resilient, sometimes surviving conditions that destroyed the rest of the body. Jenny also spoke with a local funeral director who handled both cremations and traditional burials. When she described the fire's duration and intensity, he shook his head. "I've worked on fire victims," he told her. "Even after a long blaze, you'll find something. For 5 children to be reduced to nothing, that doesn't happen in a house fire, not ever." This information fueled her growing conviction that her children had not died in the house that night. If they hadn't been inside when the flames consumed the building, then where were they? The physical evidence around the house continued to trouble her. The found ladder tossed down the embankment wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a clue. The cut telephone line, too, suggested a deliberate effort to isolate the family. The trucks failing to start was another puzzle. George was meticulous about maintenance, and the odds of both vehicles breaking down on the same night seemed impossibly slim without outside interference. Jenny also began to question the thump she had heard on the roof. She spoke with a few local men who had served in the military during World War II. Describing the sound and the green rubber object Sylvia had found in the yard. Several immediately said it sounded like a small handheld incendiary grenade, something designed not for battlefield destruction but for targeted sabotage. Such a device, thrown onto the roof, could have ignited the blaze quickly and with enough heat to trap anyone inside. But if such a device had been used, why? And by whom? Jenny's conversations with experts and locals started to reveal a troubling possibility. The fire might not have been intended to kill the children, but rather to erase evidence that they had been taken. The cut phone line, the stolen block and tackle, the disabled trucks, all of it could be part of a coordinated plan. For Jenny, these weren't the desperate theories of a grieving mother, they were the beginning of a case. She and George decided to take the next step. They would start tracking down every lead, no matter how far from Fayetteville it took them to a tampered phone line, stolen tools, and suspicious details. In the weeks following the fire, the Sodders began piecing together a web of strange details that no longer felt like coincidences. Every clue, once dismissed by the authorities, now seemed interconnected, like Fragments of a hidden story waiting to be assembled. One of the earliest discoveries was the state of the telephone line. Initially, officials had claimed it had burned during the blaze, but a local telephone repairman later told George something different. The line hadn't been burned through, it had been cut. And not cut in a sloppy or haphazard way, but cleanly severed with a sharp instrument. This meant that before the fire even started, someone had intentionally disabled the family's ability to call for help. Then there was the matter of George's tools. In the days after the fire, George realized that a block and tackle pulley system he used for his work hauling trucks was missing from the property. It had been stored near the house and was too heavy for a child to move, meaning someone had taken it. The discovery of the missing ladder down the embankment seemed to fit the same pattern. Deliberate interference designed to remove George's means of reaching the children or controlling the emergency. The disabled trucks also refused to fade from his mind. On the night of the fire, both had inexplicably failed to start. George had been using them regularly without issue, and he was confident they had been in working order earlier that day. When he examined them afterward, he suspected that someone had tampered with the engines. It was yet another obstacle that had prevented him from rescuing his children. Locals began to share strange stories, too. One neighbor claimed to have seen a man lurking near the Sodder home a few nights before the fire, fiddling with something near the garage. Another reported a pair of men parked along the road on Christmas Eve, their car positioned in a way that gave them a direct view of the Sodder property. More chilling still was a story from a bus driver passing through Fayetteville that night. He recalled seeing what looked like people throwing balls of fire at the Sodder house shortly before the flames erupted. Though the driver wasn't certain what he had witnessed, the description echoed Jenny's recollection of a thump on the roof and the strange, green object Sylvia had later found. Each piece of information deepened the Sodders' conviction that the fire had been part of something larger, something planned. If their children had been taken before the fire, perhaps to keep them quiet or as leverage for some unknown reason, the blaze would have been the perfect cover story. The authorities, however, remained unmoved. The official verdict, accidental fire, children deceased, stood firm. But George and Jenny had reached a turning point. If the local police wouldn't reopen the case, they would seek help elsewhere. They began drafting letters, contacting private investigators, and preparing to follow up on rumors of sightings far beyond Fayetteville. First reported sightings of the Sodder children in the months after the fire. Rumors began filtering back to the Sodder family, whispers that their children had been seen alive far from Fayetteville. At first, George and Jenny dismissed these as the false hopes people sometimes offered to grieving families. But then, certain accounts began to sound disturbingly specific. The first significant lead came from a woman who had been watching the fire from the roadside in the early hours of Christmas morning. She claimed she had seen figures moving inside. A passing car she believed had been parked at the edge of town earlier that evening. She thought she recognized some of the children from photographs she'd seen in the newspaper after the tragedy. Though she couldn't say for sure, she insisted the faces she saw were frightened, not sleepy. Soon after, another woman came forward. She worked at a rest stop between Fayetteville and Charleston, West Virginia, and she told police that on Christmas morning, just hours after the fire, she had served breakfast to a group of 5 children accompanied by 2 men and 2 women. The adults, she said, appeared Italian-looking and spoke to the children in rapid Italian, refusing to let them answer when she tried to make friendly conversation. She remembered the unusual atmosphere at the table. The children seemed nervous, subdued, and obedient to the adults' commands. This second report caught George's attention for another reason. The Sodders were of Italian descent, and George had spoken out against Mussolini and fascism in the years before the fire. He had received threats from certain members of the local Italian community who still supported the dictator. This sighting seemed to fit with the idea that someone from that circle might have taken the children. A third account came from a woman who ran a hotel in Charleston. She claimed that a week after the fire, a couple checked in late at night with 5 children who matched the Sodder kids' descriptions. The woman recalled that she had tried speaking to the younger children, but the older boy, who could have been John or George Jr., looked to the adults before giving short, clipped answers. The group left before dawn the next day, without checking out formally. Each new account added fuel to the Sodders' determination. They began keeping a notebook with every detail: dates, times, physical descriptions, and possible vehicle types. George traveled to Charleston and other towns, interviewing anyone who might have seen the group. The leads rarely resulted in solid proof. Sometimes the trail went cold before he even arrived, but the repetition of similar details kept the hope alive. The hardest part for George and Jenny was knowing that these sightings were largely ignored by the authorities. In their eyes, the case was closed, and any supposed sightings were chalked up to mistaken identity or wishful thinking. But for the Sodders, these accounts weren't just rumors, they were lifelines, hints that their children might still be somewhere, waiting to be found. Private investigators enter the case. By the middle of 1946, George and Jenny Sodder realized that official channels were exhausted. The Fayetteville police and the county fire marshal had long since stopped answering their letters. Even the state police had politely declined further involvement. If the family was to uncover the truth, it would have to be through private means. George reached out to a Pittsburgh detective agency recommended by a business acquaintance. The agency assigned a man named C.C. Tinsley, a quiet but dogged investigator. With a reputation for handling sensitive missing person cases, Tinsley agreed to work discreetly. Aware that the case had stirred tensions in Fayetteville's tight-knit Italian community, one of Tinsley's first tasks was to re-examine the official fire report and speak with people the Sodders believed had been overlooked during the original investigation. He discovered something unusual almost immediately: the coroner's jury that had declared the children dead and the fire accidental had been made up of several men with ties to a local insurance salesman. That salesman had been to the Sodder home a few weeks before the fire, pressuring George to buy life insurance. When George refused, the man reportedly said, "Your house is going up in smoke and your children are going to be destroyed. You'll be paid for the dirty remarks you've been making about Mussolini." It was a stunning lead, and Tinsley tracked down witnesses who remembered the salesman's visit. While it didn't prove a direct connection to the fire, it reinforced the possibility that the tragedy had been planned rather than accidental. Tinsley also investigated the odd green object Sylvia had found in the yard months after the fire. George still had an odd, pineapple-shaped casing made of metal. When Tinsley showed it to contacts familiar with military surplus, they believed it resembled the casing of a napalm grenade or incendiary device used during World War II. If true, it would explain the unusually fast spread of the fire and the strange thump Jenny had heard on the roof before the flames appeared. The investigator's inquiries into sightings also took him across state lines. In St. Louis, Missouri, Tinsley spoke to a woman who claimed to have seen the children in the company of several adults who matched earlier descriptions. In Cincinnati, Ohio, a hotel clerk swore she had registered a group of 5 children traveling with Italian-speaking adults under assumed names. While these accounts were tantalizing, they all shared the same frustrating trait: no photographs. No official records, and the trail always seemed to vanish just as quickly as it appeared. Still, Tinsley's work gave the Sodders two important things: new angles to pursue, and a renewed sense that their children had not died in that fire. But as the months passed, the family's resources began to dwindle. Hiring a private investigator was costly, and the more the Sodders pushed the case into the public eye, the more resistance they encountered from certain local figures. Yet neither George nor Jenny was willing to stop when each new lead hinted at the same haunting possibility: their children were still alive, and someone had gone to great lengths to keep them hidden. Asterisk the billboard and national attention. By 1950, nearly 5 years had passed since the Christmas Eve fire, and the Sodder children's disappearance was no closer to being solved. The official narrative that the children had perished in the blaze remained dominant in Fayetteville, but George and Jenny refused to accept it. With leads drying up and frustration boiling over, George decided it was time to make the search impossible to ignore. The idea came to him while driving along a busy highway outside Fayetteville. He saw an advertisement for a local business and thought, if people can advertise soap, why can't we advertise our missing children? Within weeks, George commissioned a massive roadside billboard with the children's photographs, names, ages at the time of the fire, and a bold headline: 5 children missing, what was their fate? The billboard also summarized the suspicious details surrounding the fire and offered a $5,000 reward for information leading to their recovery. George paid for the sign out of his own pocket, despite the mounting strain on the family's finances. The billboard faced a well-traveled route, ensuring that thousands of motorists would see it each week. The response was immediate. Letters began pouring in from across the country, some heartfelt, others bizarre. A few people claimed to have seen the children in distant states. Others offered theories ranging from organized crime abduction to witness protection by the federal government. Some leads were outright hoaxes, which hurt Jenny deeply, but the family could not afford to ignore any tip. No matter how far-fetched, newspapers in West Virginia and neighboring states picked up the story, intrigued by the boldness of the billboard. Campaign. Soon the case was being discussed in national outlets. The Sodders were interviewed for human interest pieces, and their story appeared in True Detective magazine, which specialized in real-life mysteries. The exposure brought both hope and hostility. Some locals resented the attention and believed the family was tarnishing the town's reputation. George's campaign did not stop at one sign. Over the next few years, he erected billboards in several states and even printed flyers that he personally distributed during his travels for work. Wherever he went, he spoke to locals, police officers, and journalists about his missing children. The billboard became more than just an appeal for help. It was a symbol of the Sodders' unyielding resolve. Passing drivers would often stop to read it, and travelers from out of state would write to the family after seeing it. Some leads from these sightings took George hundreds of miles from home, chasing whispers of children who might be Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, or Betty. Though none of the sightings resulted in a definitive breakthrough, the billboard kept the case alive in the public consciousness. It transformed the Sodder mystery from a small-town tragedy into a nationwide cold case, ensuring that, even as years passed, people would still be asking the same question: what really happened to the Sodder children? Breakthrough letters and the strange photograph. By the mid-1960s, 2 decades had passed since the fire, yet George and Jenny Sodder's determination had not wavered. They still pursued every possible lead, though many had ended in disappointment. Then in 1967, something unusual arrived in their mailbox that reignited their hopes and deepened the mystery. It was an ordinary day when Jenny went to collect the family's mail. Among the bills and letters was a small envelope with no return address. The postmark read Central City, Kentucky, but there was no sender's name. Inside, she found a single photograph of a young man in his 20s. On the back of the picture, written in neat block letters, were the words, Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie. Illo boys, a 90132 or 35. Jenny froze. The man in the photo had dark, wavy hair, deep-set eyes, and a strong jawline. He looked strikingly similar to her missing son Louis, who would have been in his early 20s by that time. George agreed instantly. The resemblance was uncanny, particularly in the shape of the nose and the curve of the eyebrows. The cryptic message added another layer of intrigue. The phrase, I love brother Frankie, made little sense, as the Sodders had no family member by that name. Illo boys was equally puzzling. The string, a 90132 or 35, looked like it could be a code, a postal box number, or perhaps an identification of some sort. The Sodders immediately sent the photograph to the FBI, requesting that the agency trace the sender. To their frustration, the FBI declined, stating that the case remained outside federal jurisdiction and advising them to contact Kentucky police. When they did, the Kentucky authorities claimed they had no way to investigate without more information. Undeterred, George hired another private investigator to travel to Central City. The man promised to dig into the origin of the photograph. After he left for Kentucky, the Sodders never heard from him again. He vanished entirely, and no trace of him was ever found. This eerie disappearance only deepened their suspicion that powerful forces were working to keep the truth hidden. George and Jenny enlarged the photograph and placed it alongside the images of their other children on the famous billboard. They also mailed copies to newspapers across the country, hoping someone might recognize the man or decipher the strange code on the back. Although the photograph sparked national attention once again, it brought no conclusive answers. Some believed it truly was Louis living under a different identity. Others dismissed it as a cruel prank. But for the Sodders, it was a lifeline, tangible proof in their eyes that at least one of their children had survived the fire and perhaps wanted to make contact in a veiled way. The mystery of the photograph remained one of the most haunting elements of the Sodder case. It suggested that the truth was still out there, but reaching it would require breaking through a wall of secrecy that had stood for over 20 years. Asterisk. George's final years and unfinished search. By the late 1960s, George Sodder had spent over 2 decades chasing shadows, following rumors, and facing ridicule from those who believed he should let the past go. But letting go was never an option for George. Every spare dollar he earned went toward travel, private investigators, billboard upkeep, and mail campaigns. Every conversation with strangers carried the hope that one of them might hold a missing piece of the puzzle. The strain, however, took a toll. Years of stress had worn down George's health. Friends noticed that his once boundless energy was fading, replaced by a deep weariness that only his family understood. Yet he never stopped talking about his children, particularly in the evenings when he and Jenny would sit together and rehash every detail of that night in 1945. They'd ask the same questions they had asked 1,000 times before, never reaching a satisfying answer. Despite declining health, George continued to make trips when promising leads came in. In 1968, a tip suggested that one of the children might be living under an assumed name in Florida. George traveled alone, hoping to avoid attention, but the lead proved fruitless. It was the kind of disappointment he had endured dozens of times. But each one weighed more heavily on him as the years passed. Jenny, while equally devoted, became increasingly protective of George's energy. She urged him to rest more and to stop chasing every rumor. But George's fear was simple. If he slowed down, time would run out not just for him, but for his missing children. He was convinced they were still alive somewhere, and he feared that stopping the search would mean abandoning them. The photograph from 1967 remained a focal point in their home. George often studied it late at night, tracing the features of the man he believed to be Louis. He wrote letters to cryptographers, journalists, and even amateur sleuths, hoping someone could decode the strange message. Each reply that arrived, without answers, only sharpened his sense of frustration. On August 16, 1969, George passed away quietly at home. He was 73 years old. He had not found his children, but his obituary reflected the unshakable devotion that had defined his life. A father who never ceased to search. His funeral was attended by family, friends, and even strangers who had been touched by his story over the years. The billboard remained standing, visible from the highway, a testament to his refusal to give up. Jenny, though heartbroken, vowed to continue the search alone. She wore black mourning clothes for the rest of her life, a constant symbol of her grief. For her, George's death marked the end of one chapter, but not the closing of the book. She still believed that one day the truth would come out. The Sodder mystery, now more than 2 decades old, was no closer to resolution, but the flame of determination still burned, passed from George to Jenny like a torch that would not be extinguished. Asterisk. Jenny's years of quiet vigil after George's death in 1969. The Sodder home became a quieter place, but the silence was not one of acceptance. It was the stillness of vigilance. Jenny remained in Fayetteville, living in the same house where her family had laughed, played, and, on that terrible Christmas Eve, changed forever. For her, moving away would have felt like abandoning the children who were still missing. Every morning, Jenny would tend to her home and then walk out to check the condition of the billboard along Route 16. The image of her children, frozen in time, stared back at passing motorists. She personally saw to its upkeep, repainting it when the weather wore it down and replacing damaged photos. Even as years passed and hairstyles, cars, and the town itself changed, the billboard stayed the same, a haunting reminder of a family. Frozen in grief, Jenny continued to follow leads, though she approached them differently than George had. Instead of rushing to chase every rumor, she sifted through tips more cautiously, writing letters to verify details before sending investigators. This quieter, methodical approach kept her from exhausting herself as George had, but the outcome was often the same: dead ends, conflicting accounts, and strange coincidences that went nowhere. Her grief expressed itself in physical ways, too. After the fire, Jenny had adopted the habit of wearing black mourning clothes, and she never stopped. For over 2 decades after George's passing, neighbors saw her in long black dresses and veils, an unspoken signal that her mourning had never ended. People in town sometimes whispered about her persistence, some with pity, others with admiration. Jenny was also deeply private, but the case ensured she was never entirely out of the public eye. Occasionally, journalists would arrive unannounced, hoping to reignite national interest in the Sodder mystery. Jenny would grant interviews only when she felt the reporter was respectful and genuinely interested in uncovering the truth. Too many times, she had seen her story treated as a curiosity or a sensational mystery rather than a human tragedy. Even in her later years, Jenny maintained correspondence with amateur sleuths, family friends, and strangers who had read about the case. Some sent her clippings about children who resembled the Sodders. Others mailed cryptic letters claiming insider knowledge. Though most of these amounted to nothing, Jenny treated each one seriously, filing them in a box that she kept. In her bedroom, Jenny also held on to one unshakable belief: the fire had not killed her 5 children. This conviction was not born from hope alone. It was reinforced by the unanswered questions about the fire's cause, the strange witnesses, and the mysterious photograph from 1967 until her final days. She believed that someone, somewhere, knew the truth and that it could still be uncovered. Jenny Sodder passed away in 1989 at the age of 85. The billboard she had tended for decades stood for a few more years after her death, until it was finally removed in the early 1990s. By then, the case had faded from public attention, but for the surviving Sodder children, the mystery remained an open wound. The surviving siblings take up the search. When Jenny Sodder passed away in 1989, the mantle of the family's decades-long investigation fell to the surviving Sodder children. The loss of both parents meant there was no longer a central figure keeping the search alive, but for the siblings, the mystery was too deeply woven into their identities to ever abandon. Sylvia, the youngest of the Sodder children and only 2 years old at the time of the fire, took on a particularly active role. Though she had no direct memories of the night itself, she had grown up surrounded by the story. Every photograph, every whispered conversation, every frustrated sigh from her parents had been part of her upbringing. By the time she was an adult, Sylvia knew the case as intimately as anyone could. She began to organize the family's files, preserving letters, photographs, and police documents that George and Jenny had collected. Her older siblings, John, George Jr., Marion, and others, supported the effort in varying degrees. Some had grown weary of the endless dead ends, preferring to protect their own children from the obsession that had consumed their parents. Others joined Sylvia in actively pursuing new leads, particularly as technology made it easier to connect with people across the country. The internet was in its infancy in the early 1990s, but even limited online. Bulletin boards and genealogy groups offered a fresh avenue for inquiry. The siblings continued to encounter the same problems that had plagued their parents: contradictory witness statements, destroyed records, and an almost complete lack of cooperation from official agencies. Over time, they learned to temper their expectations, understanding that a promising lead could evaporate as quickly as it appeared. Still, the Sodder children found ways to keep the case alive in public memory. They gave interviews to local papers, participated in true crime radio programs, and corresponded with amateur investigators who had stumbled across the case in old crime magazines. Sylvia, in particular, made it her mission to keep the family's side of the story clear and accessible, wary of the way myths and embellishments tended to creep into RETLLINGS. By the mid-1990s, interest in cold cases was on the rise, thanks to television programs like Unsolved Mysteries and America's Most Wanted. Though the Sodder case was not featured in depth on these shows, brief mentions and online discussions began drawing a new generation of curiosity seekers. Some of them offered theories ranging from plausible scenarios of abduction to outlandish tales involving organized crime, secret government plots, and mistaken identity. For the surviving siblings, the passing years brought both clarity and frustration. On one hand, the fire had happened so long ago that most witnesses and officials from the original investigation were gone, meaning there were fewer people to challenge or obstruct the family's search. On the other hand, those same passing years meant that potential answers were slipping further out of reach, locked away in the memories of people who had taken them to the grave. The Sodder children, like their parents before them, refused to declare the case closed. For them, the search was not just about solving a mystery, it was about honoring the 5 siblings they had lost, ensuring they would never be forgotten. The internet era and renewed public interest. The late 1990s and early 2000s marked a turning point in how cold cases like the Sodder mystery reached the public. The rise of the Internet gave amateur investigators, journalists, and everyday true crime enthusiasts a powerful platform to share information, theories, and archival material. For the first time since the 1940s, the Sodder case began attracting widespread attention beyond Fayetteville, West Virginia. In the early days of online forums, true crime discussion boards became a kind of virtual town square. People posted summaries of the Sodder fire, scanned old newspaper clippings, and debated the most likely explanations for the children's disappearance. Some users even tracked down rare interviews and photographs, digitizing them so others could study small details that had previously been inaccessible. Websites dedicated to unsolved mysteries, many run by volunteers, began including the Sodder story in their archives. These pages often presented the case in chronological detail, highlighting the unusual facts that had kept the mystery alive for decades. The suspicious phone call just before the fire, the missing ladder, the cut phone lines, and the lack of human remains in the ash. Theories multiplied, ranging from accidental mishandling by local authorities to elaborate conspiracies involving organized crime. For Sylvia Sodder, now an adult raising her own family, the Internet was both a blessing and a challenge. On one hand, it connected her with people who cared deeply about the case and were willing to investigate. On the other, it exposed the story to rampant speculation and occasional misinformation. Inaccuracies could spread quickly online, sometimes distorting the Sodder's own account of events. Sylvia took it upon herself to correct the record whenever possible, often responding to emails from strangers who had read about the case and wanted clarification. The renewed attention also drew in professional journalists and documentarians. Regional newspapers revisited the fire in anniversary pieces, often featuring interviews with surviving family members. A few independent filmmakers expressed interest in producing a documentary, though none reached completion during this period. Still, the persistence of the story in public consciousness was a source of quiet encouragement for the Sodders. As true crime blogs and early social media platforms like MySpace and Facebook emerged, the Sodder case found new audiences worldwide. International readers were often struck by the fact that such a dramatic, unresolved case had never been officially solved, or even conclusively closed. This global reach led to new tips, though most were either recycled from decades past or unverifiable. By the mid-2000s, the Sodder fire had taken on an almost legendary status in online mystery circles. It was often cited as one of America's most enduring unsolved family tragedies, sitting alongside cases like the Lindbergh kidnapping and the disappearance of the Beaumont children in Australia. For the Sodder family, this growing attention offered hope, but also served as a reminder of how much time had passed without answers. The Internet had breathed new life into the story, but the core question remained unchanged since that snowy night in 1945. What really happened to the 5 Sodder children? Modern investigations and scientific possibilities. By the late 2000s, advances in forensic science began reshaping how cold cases were approached. DNA analysis, ground-penetrating radar, and digital reconstruction of crime scenes offered possibilities that had been unimaginable in the 1940s. For the surviving Sodder family members and their supporters, these technologies sparked cautious optimism. Perhaps after all these years, science could succeed where witness statements and traditional police work had failed. One area of interest was the physical evidence from the fire itself. Early reports from 1945 claimed that virtually no human remains were found, despite the belief that 5 children had perished in the blaze. Critics of the official conclusion pointed out that even in intense fires, bones, especially those of children, are often at least partially recoverable. In theory, modern forensic anthropologists could re-examine any preserved debris to search for overlooked remains. Unfortunately, nearly all of the original ash and rubble had been discarded in the immediate aftermath of the fire. Long before such techniques existed, another promising avenue was DNA testing. If any trace remains from the fire or from the mysterious human vertebra found in the 1960s could be located, it might be possible to compare the genetic material to that of living Sodder relatives. However, when the vertebra had been tested, decades earlier by the Smithsonian, it had been deemed too old to belong to any of the Sodder children. Whether new testing could yield different results remained uncertain, especially given doubts about whether the bone fragment was even preserved. Some amateur investigators suggested using ground-penetrating radar to survey the site of the old Sodder home. The theory was that if any remains had been missed during the hurried cleanup, they might still be buried under the soil. Others proposed searching properties where the children were rumored to have been taken in case they had been buried or otherwise hidden there. Yet these ideas face significant legal and logistical hurdles, including property rights, lack of official police involvement, and the sheer passage of time. The growth of genealogical DNA databases also stirred interest. These services had famously solved decades-old crimes, such as identifying the Golden State Killer. Could they also locate living descendants of the missing Sodder children, if any had survived and started families under different identities? While theoretically possible, this approach relied on the cooperation of people who might not even know they were connected to the Sodder family. In the end, the biggest obstacle was not technology, but access. Without preserved evidence, official cooperation, or a clear trail to follow, even the most sophisticated forensic tools could not conjure answers from nothing. Still, the possibility lingered in the minds of the Sodder family. If even one fragment of verifiable evidence could be found, modern science might finally tell them the truth. For now, those hopes remain suspended between possibility and reality, waiting for the right combination of discovery, resources, and determination to break the case wide open. The legacy of the case in popular culture. As the decades passed, the Sodder children's disappearance evolved from a local mystery into a story firmly embedded in American true crime lore. It began appearing in anthologies of unsolved mysteries, often alongside ghost stories and historical curiosities, capturing the imagination of readers who had never set foot in West Virginia. The combination of family tragedy, wartime tension, and unanswered questions made the Sodder case uniquely enduring. Television embraced the mystery as well. Shows like Unsolved Mysteries and later Mystery at the Museum featured dramatized segments of the fire and the events leading up to it. These programs often relied on interviews with surviving family members, reenactments of key moments like the mysterious woman spotted with children at a Charleston hotel, and lingering shots of the famous billboard George Sodder had erected along Route 16 for many viewers. These televised versions were their first introduction to the case, cementing it in popular consciousness. Podcasts, which surged in popularity during the 2010s, gave the Sodder story a new platform. True crime hosts often dedicated hour-long episodes to walking listeners through the timeline, pausing to debate each strange detail. The threatening stranger who visited the Sodder home weeks before the fire, the cut phone lines, and the inexplicable disappearance of the family's ladder. Because podcasting allowed for long-form storytelling, hosts could explore competing theories in depth, from plausible explanations to far-fetched conspiracies. Books also played a role in keeping the case alive. Some authors devoted entire chapters to it in compilations of American mysteries, while others attempted full-length explorations. Though most added no new evidence, they ensured the story reached new generations. In many of these retellings, the Sodders were portrayed as victims not only of a possible crime, but of an incomplete and perhaps negligent investigation and angle that resonated with readers who distrusted institutions. The visual symbol most associated with the case remained the Sodder family billboard. Originally erected in 1952, it featured the children's photos, their names, and the blunt question, what was their fate? Even after George Sodder's death in 1969, the billboard stood for decades, maintained by surviving family members. It became a roadside landmark and a pilgrimage site for true crime enthusiasts. When it was finally removed in the late 1980s due to deterioration, its absence was felt by locals who had grown up with its watchful presence. In the realm of internet culture, the case became a staple on listicles like 10 Creepiest Unsolved Mysteries and Cases That Will Haunt You. Reddit threads, YouTube documentaries, and TikTok videos have since brought the story to younger audiences, many of whom speculate wildly without knowing the full historical context. What makes the Sodder case so resilient in popular culture is its balance of tragedy and mystery. It has all the elements of a compelling narrative: an ordinary family, ominous warnings, a disaster, official confusion, and the haunting possibility that the missing children might have lived. These elements ensure that, even without resolution, the story remains as gripping in the 21st century as it was in the winter of 1945. The enduring mystery and the family's final years. By the time the 1980s rolled around, the Sodder case had already outlived nearly all of its original investigators. George Sodder had died in 1969, still convinced his children had survived and determined that foul play was involved. Jenny Sodder, his wife, lived until 1989 and remained equally steadfast in her belief that the fire had been a cover for an abduction. She wore black mourning clothes for the rest of her life, a visual reminder of her grief and her refusal to accept the official version of events. The surviving Sodder children carried the weight of the mystery well into adulthood. Each responded differently. Some devoted themselves to keeping the case alive in the media, while others sought privacy, exhausted by decades of speculation and dead ends. Despite differences in how they processed their loss, they remained united in one conviction: that the truth had never been uncovered. After Jenny's death, the family billboard, once a towering symbol of defiance, was finally removed. Its absence marked the end of a visible public campaign, but not the end of the family's quiet search. The Sodders still fielded occasional letters, phone calls, and even personal visits from strangers who claimed to have information about the missing children. Most tips led nowhere, but each one stirred a familiar flicker of hope. Meanwhile, public interest in the case would rise and fall in cycles. Whenever a new article, book, or TV feature appeared, reporters would inevitably seek out surviving family members for comment. Some welcomed the renewed attention, believing that any publicity could bring answers. Others found it painful to reopen old wounds, especially when interviews recycled the same frustrating uncertainties. Were the children taken? Was the fire an accident? Why had the investigation been so limited? In private moments, the family considered more personal questions. If the children had lived, had they known about the search for them? Had they been kept from contacting their family out of fear, coercion, or ignorance of their true identities? And if they had died that night, why had there been no conclusive physical proof? These unanswered questions were not just historical puzzles, they were personal ghosts, shaping the family's identity across generations. By the turn of the 21st century, the remaining Sodder siblings were elderly. Some passed away without ever learning the truth. Others left instructions for their children and grandchildren to keep the search alive, at least informally. In this way, the mystery was passed down like an heirloom, less a story to tell than a duty to remember. Today, the Sodder children's disappearance remains one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries. It is a story preserved in archives, media accounts, and the memories of those who lived through it. The case's endurance is a testament to the human need for closure, and the lengths to which a family will go when love refuses to yield to loss. Whether the truth lies buried in forgotten evidence, hidden in family secrets, or lost forever to time, one fact is certain for the Sodders: the night of December 24, 1945, never truly ended.